Assalamualaikum and hi, I'm Putri Syahirah and I'm presenting my final thesis assessment, which is Mangrove Ecological Research Station as a living ecological infrastructure. So the Mangrove Ecological Research Station is a living ecological infrastructure concept in supporting coastal mangrove rehabilitation and protecting coastline from severe erosion through three main strategies, which is first to dissipate wave energy, second to stimulate, which is support biodiversity through rehabilitation, and lastly to educate coastal community as coastal guardian. So thus in achieving the objectives, a floating, elevating and tetrahedral modular structure, a synergized crossing on land, on water and underwater as a living ecological infrastructure for a healthy symbiotic relationship of coastal ecosystem. We can see the important role of mangrove in the coastal ecosystem and how does the coastal ecosystem depends on each other, how the mangrove protect the Kukup mainland from flood and storm events that become nursery ground for marine life, and the ecological itself provide food and income to the community. But what happened now, the local community is facing an ecological issues such as land reclamation, coastal erosion, water quality and disastrous threat. The ecological issues leads to socio-economic issues where there is massive decimation of fish stock, change of main occupation and water quality degradation, and loss of sense of place of attachment where young generation tends to move away from the village, and not to say political issues. So in those all issues, what can an architecture to intervene in those issues? So the hypothesis of the design is how can an architecture act as an ecological device to support the ecosystem. The aim of the design is to propose a responsive and architectural mechanism for coastal rehabilitation that support the ecosystem. The first objective is to provide an architectural infrastructure to protect the coastline from severe erosion. Next, to rehabilitate coastal mangrove. And lastly, to innovate an architectural module to support the coastal biodiversity. So the Mangrove Ecological Research Station is a coastal ecological protection that houses mangrove research and monitoring as a tool to educate awareness to the community as a coastal infrastructure and as a mangrove and breeding nursery. It implements a sharing knowledge culture between researcher, local community and other community. So in order to design, we work based on the worst case scenario, where due to the facts given, from 0 to 5 years, the coastal community will exposed to the shoreline erosion, sea level rise and mangrove degradation. So what happened to the 5 to 10 years in the future? Due to the threats, there were loss of biodiversity, coastal land loss, and what happened to the 10 and next 30 years. There were a death of coastal ecosystem and threats to natural disaster. So the design aim to as a coastal protection and to support the biodiversity and as a community survival. Three structural strategy have been implemented in order to achieve the aim, which is a floating structure, elevated and floating, and elevated structure. So the site located at Kukup, just adjacent to the local Kampung Kukup Air Masin. Here is the floating layer where the first zone house to celebrate community involvement. The middle one is for research, and the last one for accommodation. The module float with styrofoam pontoon that comes with piping services line, and the column and the decking made from timber, and it sets to the seabed ground with a taut leg mooring system that capable in withstand horizontal and vertical forces due to elasticity of the mooring line. And the mooring system moored to prefab artificial concrete coral reef that comes with ground anchorage to benefit habitat and anglers. It's also equipped with a monitoring 5G monitoring sensor to monitor the progress of the research or the progress of the water quality and basically for research. The floating module up to few sizes. First, which is XS, the floating mangrove sapling pot. It produces mangrove sapling that to be transferred to another affected area. The S size comprise of a floating urban farming and a floating gazebo for community. The M size comprise of research station, seafood cafe, convertible event and office space, boat and netting workshop. Basically, most of the module in the floating module are M module. So basically, the research station house a habitable space for living and working, and is a floating system structure with it can reduce seismic forces and as a living breakwater that enhance the stability, and it use mooring system that moored to artificial tetrahedral reef as an artificial marine life habitat to stimulate natural breeding nursery, and it houses a floating mangrove sapling pot which is an arboretum. So the floating module itself acts as an armor to the coastal threats, where it is a living breakwater that dissipate the wave energy for the ecology, and it is also a breeding home for marine biodiversity that support the marine. The L and XL size is an elevated module that set on land. There are only few of it. The elevated module is strategic. The strategy is to limit or to minimize the footprint on the land, but it hold the other structure, the floating structure, and it is as a living laboratory for the community learning on the existing mangrove. So here is how the modular structure being constructed. First, we just pick the size, either XS, SM, L, XL, and pick the foundation, the floating foundation, assemble the pontoon, the utility box and the steel frame together. The other part is constructed through CNC printing. We use 18mm marine plywood components. It is manufactured through CNC wood machine. So next, number 4, we assemble the structural parts and accessories are assembled together at the selected jetty and head to the degraded mangrove area, and the module is unloaded to the water body and carried to the desired area. And lastly, mooring process. The module is moored to an artificial coral reef that comes with anchorage. So here is how the integrated coastal protection strategy works. So there are 3 zones, which is a floating zone, elevated and floating zone, and the last one is an elevated zone. So what are the floating zone do? The floating zone is it dissipate the wave energy, where it act as a wave breaker. It is a floating research station and arboretum, and it is artificial coral reef park at the seabed to attract marine species, and it is community and leisure area, such as boat and netting workshop, seafood cafe that runs by the local community. So the elevated and floating zone, it is at the middle. It stimulates the natural marine breeding nursery. The engine boat is restricted at this zone. It's also as a connector and transfer the energy and services such as electrical and sewage. There is a floating fish farmway that generated by the wave energy. The catch of the fish cage are meant for marine research, but it can be harvested during undesired times like in monsoon times. So the elevated zone, the role is to rehabilitate the degraded mangrove area. So first, it rehabilitate and monitoring research on existing mangrove. It's also a natural mollusk breeding nursery such as crab. It's also a living laboratory for community to learn. So this is how the integrated coastal protection strategy works to support the ecosystem, to support the biodiversity, to protect the shoreline from shoreline erosion, and to give a sense of security to the local community, that there are tools that taking care of them, that there are tools that dissipate the wave energy for marine breeding and for mangrove rehabilitation. So this is how the role of each layer to as a coastal protection that support the biodiversity for the community survival. There are diverse program. It's also as an armor as to protect the coastline from severe erosion and stimulate the mangrove rehabilitation through floating strategy that act as a wave breaker and elevated and floating to transmit the energy between the land and the water, an elevated structure that minimize the footprint, but as a living laboratory for the local community to learn about the ecology. So what are the design shape the future ecosystem, and how the design shape the future ecosystem? The mangrove sapling pot will boot to the degraded mangrove area, and the pot will sprouting the root and grasping the soil and strengthen the soil condition and build a mangrove community. So from time to time, the sapling pot will grow to become a mangrove tree, another mangrove community. It's also available for future expansion. So the design, just how the mangrove fruits sprout and spread, the research station could extend over time due to demand. Expand the module would expand the marine and coral sanctuary at the seabed. So the breakwater feature of the floating structure will stimulate more mangrove site at the mainland. So this is how the flexible and mobility of the design shape the future expansion. So here is the best case scenario within 10 years. So as the mangrove site is protected from severe wave impact, the existing mangrove would pollinate more sapling species, and the soil condition getting stronger over years, and that reversing the sea level rise issues, thus prevent the coastal area from shoreline erosion and achieve long-term economic and residential security for the community. So from 0 years up to 2 to 5 years, we will see new mangrove community develop over years up to 10 years. So 10 years old mangrove forest will successfully reduce such impact, and they can act on their own as a natural defense from storm events. So it is a mangrove ecological research station with living ecological infrastructure concept through integrated coastal protection strategy that support the coastal biodiversity through marine ecosystem and rehabilitate mangrove. And it is also a wave dissipator that could act to reverse the climate change, to reverse the sea level rise issues, and also it's for coastal ecosystem survival. So the integrated coastal protection strategy that supports the coastal biodiversity for coastal ecosystem survival that would contribute to sustainable development goals. So the key principle of the design is as a habitat regeneration. It's towards the zero energy. The design locally sourced material through timber and pontoon, and it's also combat the climate change, and it's a floating community model, and how the temporal structure towards a permanency function react over years, and it's also for mangrove reforestation. It's a coastal protection, the mobility of the design, and the sharing education culture, and economical modular construction. Lastly, a diverse program. So I think that's all from me, and thank you.